Hi, I'm George DeCastro with the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, and we're in our office today in Washington, D.C. And I'm here with Jerry Martin, who's a Vietnam veteran and a longtime volunteer with the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. And so I've just brought him in today, and we're going to ask him a few questions and get to know him a little more. I understand that you did have a long service in Vietnam. Would you like to talk about that for a little bit?
I was in Vietnam from 1968 until 1969, uh, and I served with the 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marine Regiment, 3rd Marine Division, initially as an infantry platoon commander and an infantry company commander. After my infantry tour, I stayed and participated as an air observer working with the 3rd Marine Division infantry units, but in a different capacity, doing air reconnaissance, acting as a forward air controller airborne, and adjusting artillery and naval gunfire in support of the infantry maneuver battalions.
When you did get back home, what do you think prompted you to seek out the BBMF and what prompted you to volunteer with them?
Well, I'll be honest. When I first came home, like most Vietnam veterans, I think there was a reluctance on many of us, or reluctance by many of us, to become too involved in veterans affairs. And I remember when Jan Scruggs first started uh, the effort to build the wall back in the late 70s. Many of us uh, were unsure about a memorial for a war that had been so unpopular in our country. And I remember going to a mall, and there was someone collecting money for the memorial. And my son was a little guy at that point, I think maybe less than 10 years old. Uh, and he asked me, Dad, what are they collecting money for? What kind of memorial is it going to be? And I said, son, I'm not really sure. And I remember going over and listening to the individual who was there collecting money. And I think there may have even been a radio station involved at that time. And they were talking about this memorial that Mr. Scruggs was trying to have put on the mall. And as I recall, there was like a big jar there. So I remember reaching into my wallet and giving my son $1, and I said, "Here, son, uh, donate $1." And I said, "That way you can remember that you helped build the memorial if it happens." So that was my first experience, and that was probably in the late 1970s in Arlington, Virginia.
Now, had you met Jan Scruggs at all?
Had not. I didn't meet Jan Scruggs until, I mean, actually meet Jan. I had seen Jan because I was there when the wall was the first experience with the wall was 1982 when the wall was dedicated. And along with many other veterans at that time, I was still on active duty. So I remember I had taken time off from uh, headquarters Marine Corps where I was stationed at that time and actually gone over for the dedication. And since all of our officers, senior officers at that point, were all Vietnam veterans, generals and colonels, they were all agreeable to letting those of us that wanted to go, were Vietnam veterans, to participate in the dedication. So I remember walking over there, and I had my son with me because I had brought my son to work that day with the express purpose of going over to the dedication. And we listened to the dedication, and it was in November of 1982. It was not a very nice day, typical November day in D.C., kind of cold, kind of wet, kind of muddy. And I remember standing there and seeing Jan on the podium talking about the dedication, and then I looked right next to my son, and there was a fella in a trench coat standing right next to us. And he looked down at my son, and I recognized him as General Westmoreland. And General Westmoreland was standing right next to us, and he reached down and stretched out his hand and said, young man, he said, I want you to thank your dad for his service. And Westmoreland shook my son's hand. And I remember, how taken back I was to think that here was the guy who had been the commander of all forces in Vietnam talking to my son. Although he didn't say anything to me, he just looked down at my son and said, thank your dad for his service. And I think that was the first time I had really seen Jan, although I didn't meet Jan that day, and really didn't actually meet Jan until many years later, 2001, when Jan hosted the first Teachers Network session at Georgetown University, which later became the Teachers Teach Vietnam Network.
That's a very cool story. Before we get into the Teach Vietnam Teachers Network, you did have a background in education.
Yes. I had a history degree, an education degree from Louisiana State University, and was teaching and started teaching in 1989 after I left service. Well, really after I received my master's degree and teacher certificate. I started 1988. I started working on my master's in education at George Mason University, and also was working on my teaching certificate as a result of my service in Vietnam. There was the veterans readjustment for those veterans that had received service-connected disability. And so I participated in that program, finished a master's degree, and then my teaching certificate, and started teaching in 1989 in the city of Manassas in Virginia.
So it's safe to say that your teaching career brought you to BBMF.
Absolutely.
Cool.
Absolutely it did. In fact, I think it was in 2000, year 2000, the BBMF actually solicited teachers nationwide to participate in a program to determine how the Vietnam War should be taught in school. And that was primarily because there was very little mention of that in most of the state-adopted textbooks at that time. So we all sat down, and I remember many of us actually brought the textbooks that we were using. And in our case, in the state of Virginia, as I recall, there was only about 2 pages in the textbook that really referred to the Vietnam War. And within those 2 pages, about half of the text was written text, and the rest were photographs. And the 2 photographs that come to mind were the one of the poor little child Phuc Mai running down the road being burned by napalm, and the other photograph was a picture of a Huey helicopter lifting off the embassy for the evacuation of Saigon in 1975. And I think we all felt that there was more to the story than the brutality that many people felt was the story of the war, the brutality to civilians, and then the evacuation of Vietnam, which many people looked as the end of the war, but the first war that America had ever lost. And I think most of us said, there's more to that story. There's tremendous stories of valor and sacrifice, just as there have been in every war that we participated in. And I said, I think, as many of us thought, that they needed to tell the story of the people who were involved in the war as much as the political events of the war.
So then what would you say is the most important thing that came out of the Teach Vietnam Teachers Network?
I think that the consensus that the state-adopted textbooks had to be expanded and to talk more about how this war was very similar to other wars, that the people who participated in the Vietnam War were the same kind of people who had participated in other wars, your neighbors,
right.
Your dads, the guys who had gone off and done what their country had asked them to do, whether they were drafted or volunteered, their intentions were the same as they had been in other wars, and that was to serve their country.
And where do you think the future of the Teach Vietnam Teachers Network is going? What can future educators get out of it?
Well, my generation of teachers are either retired or reaching retirement. So, in my mind, it's an educational process, and that is teaching new teachers about Vietnam. Probably not unlike the veterans of the First War and the Second War who used to come in and talk to classes and to teachers and to tell them about their experiences. So, in my mind, this new generation of teachers are going to learn about the war, but they're going to learn about the war perhaps from those of us who were part of that generation while we're still able to teach about that generation. So I'd like to think that the role of the Teach Vietnam Teachers Network is a generational thing. For those of us who started this Teachers Network, we're providing them the continuity that they're going to need to teach future students about that experience. Unless we do that, unless we personalize that wall for this generation and future generations, then it becomes a very inanimate object. I mean, it becomes basically a tombstone. And I don't think any of us who participated in that war would ever be satisfied with thinking that when we're gone, it's just this solemn marker in our nation's mall without there being some vitality to those people who gave so much for that wall to be there.
And how do you think the BBMF and the listeners, and I would say veterans of all wars, can benefit from the kinds of things that we'll talk about?
Well, I think that's a very good question, George. I think that listeners are going to be able to learn things that they never knew about that generation of servicemen and women. I think veterans are going to be able to tell stories that maybe for the last 40-something years have been unspoken. And I look back to conversations that I had with my grandfather and uncles about their experience. It wasn't until maybe the latter part of their lives that they really talked about those things, those events that affected them, and how personal some of those memories were. And the reluctance to talk about it during their lifetime was one towards the ends of their lives. They felt that they needed to talk about so people would remember not only them, but the names of those people that they knew before they were forgotten.
Do you think people have an accurate view of the Vietnam War as it is?
No, I don't. I think that the Vietnam War has been so stereotyped that the perception of the Vietnam War is one of, I guess, guts and jungle, if I were going to, synthesize it into a simple phrase. And I don't really think that that is an accurate description. I think there was a tremendous amount of heroism in that war, but I also think there was a tremendous amount of our society that's reflected in that war, and that's the values of our society at the time. And I think probably no other war other than the Civil War probably polarized our society the way that time frame did in our nation. So I think people need to know that maybe in some ways this is the beginning of what many people believe America became. So in that regard, that war is more than just an event. I mean, it was a catalyst for change within our society. The one thing I remember more than anything else about how I felt during that time frame was the fact that in 1968, the election the presidential election, I was the only one in my platoon who was really eligible to vote because you had to be 21 years of age to vote. And I was the only guy within 25 guys that could really vote. And when I did get my ballot, it was an absentee ballot. The ballot had already been cast in America. The president was already decided. And I said, by God, I'm going to vote because I can. And I remember casting my ballot, even though it wasn't going to be counted, just to say that I had voted, because it was the first time I was able to vote in a national election. So when you stop and think about that, I mean, that in itself was a marker event. And because of that war, when people said if an 18, 19, 20-year-old man or woman can give their life for their country, why are they denied the vote? So that changed. And so to me, that was a very important part of our society. I think the other part of that war that really comes home to me is the fact that for the first time in my life, having grown up in the segregated South, I saw the impact of civil rights because I sat next to guys who were black, men who were brown, because they were Hispanic, and myself, who was white from the South. We sat, we shared the same food, literally out of the same can. We passed a cigarette around to smoke, and we drank out of the same coffee cup, and suddenly realized that every one of us was an American, no matter what our color was or what our political beliefs were. And that, to me, I guess the point that brought that home was that when blood dried, it dried brown on our uniform no matter what color our skin was.
So, in terms of nowadays, do you think children or just people growing up in school in general, young people, do you think they're educated well about the Vietnam War as it stands? Or do you
No,
think
I
there could
don't.
be improvement?
I think that it's probably something that is probably just given very cursory attention in the classroom. And based on some of the school's perceptions about those things that need to be taught and those things that can be taught, that it probably is given a lesser priority than other things. But yet, when I look at it, I mean, when you look at Vietnam, it was really the synthesis of everything that took place in our country in the mid 20th century.
Nowadays, at the wall, now that even though you think education really isn't at a level at which they've learned about it well enough, when there is an opportunity for young people to visit the wall, how do you feel that they haven't lived through it?
Well, I think unless there's someone there to interpret the wall for them, it's just another national landmark. And I think that's the importance of BBMF and the role that BBMF plays. And that is to ensure that the wall is interpreted for people, that it's not just a granite landmark, that it's really a story, and it's a story of our nation and part of our nation's history. And unless it's given that kind of perception for young people visiting the wall, I mean, it's just 10 minutes out of their Washington tour when they come to D.C. to see the monuments.
So it all comes back to education.
It does come back to education and teachers being able to understand the wall and what the wall meant to those of us who participated in that event.
Well, I'm excited. I hope that you're excited, and I hope the readers are all very excited for what we're going to be bringing to the table in these coming weeks and months.
Well, thank you. I look forward to participating.
Again, it's been really great having you.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to talk, and I look forward to talking to other veterans.